start focusing on some really concrete stuff. We're going to start with perimeter, and we're using perimeter in real world problems, as well as talking about polygons. And when we talk about these things, we are using our ruler still, so this is still our main component, but we're coupling it with some attributes of geometry, and you could also look at the progressions chapter on geometry as well. So when we talk about these real world problems, we want students to be able to label the shapes. We want them to be able to measure a shape, and we want to be able to label it for accuracy. Is it inches? Is it feet? You know, we want them to be accurate. If the word problem is telling us how much that each side is worth, we want to make sure that we're labeling it how much each side is worth. We want to make sure that we are using our rulers to properly measure those sides. When we talk about measuring the sides of polygons and the sides of quadrilaterals and things like that, we also want to make sure that our students are able to subdivide. And that here where a number line is helpful, but we want to make sure that students know that between 7 and 8 is going to be 7 1/2, it's going to be 7 3/4, it's going to be 7 1/4. And we want to make sure that students can do that students can see that there is space between those inch marks on a ruler, that we can go a little bit above and a little bit below without just being distinctly 4 inches and distinctly 5 inches. There's space in between, and I think that that's an important aspect that students they need to know. They need to be able to determine that for themselves. We also want them to be able to compose and decompose shapes that are already there. We want them to be able to make triangles and make squares and make triangles and make all these different shapes. But they have to know the properties of those shapes. They have to know that a square has to be 5 inches all around, and then a rectangle has to have 2 sides that are the same top and bottom, and matching sides that are a different length but are the same on left and right. So students need to be exposed to that, and they need to be able to make them for themselves. We want them to be able to recognize a square for a square. We want to be able them to take apart that square and see that all 4 sides of the square are of equal length, and we want them to be able to make them for themselves. Start talking about congruency and which shapes have the same attributes and which shapes do not. We also want to talk about similar shapes, and if 2 squares, even though they're both squares, they can be vastly different sizes. I can have a small square and I can have a large square, but if they're related, they can be similar. I'm also going to want to start talking about area in a more complex way, and to do that I want to start talking about an array. I can use an array, and I want to encourage students to use visual and strategies to be able to solve these things. I want to have them draw the array, and I want to physically count the boxes that are inside these shapes. Now, as it goes on, we're not always going to be able to draw an array, but I want to start there, and I want them to be able to see that area is the amount of space inside, how much it's taking up, how much I can get inside of that fence. And the perimeter is my fence. So I want to make sure that I have those 2 things very kind of definitely worked out in a very concrete way. And as I move on, I can also add the 3rd dimension, which is I can start talking about volume. And we're not going to do 3D shapes yet, but we want students to be able to realize that there is a 3rd attribute of shapes, and that there is something that they can further do with those shapes. So we want to start focusing on that. And just to pull it back to area and perimeter, I also want to make sure that students, for like a higher level student, that we can see which shapes, that we're making shapes that have the same perimeter but different areas, or we're making shapes that have the same area but different perimeters. And students need to be able to wrap their minds around, well, how can a shape have the same perimeter but I'd be able to fit more or less inside? And I think that that's really important to especially show those visuals, but being able to use our tools to do it is a really exciting way to experience measurement as well as geometry. Alright, so we're nearing the end. In 4th grade, we're starting to see that light at the end of the tunnel, and now we're getting really into the meaty aspects of measurement, and this is kind of where my favorite part of measurement is. So as we start, we're going to start in 4th grade with conversions. We're starting to take larger elements and we're bringing them into smaller. How many inches are in a foot? How many kilometers are in a meter? We're making things bigger and smaller, and we're adjusting them so that we can compare and successfully add different units of measure. So we're using our basic arithmetic, but now we're combining it with measurement. And this is kind of really challenging for students. I know for my students especially, it's definitely kind of a very tangled area for them, and it takes time to kind of bring those two elements together. But once they do, then they are really successful in further measurement tasks. The next thing that we're going to be doing is when we're talking about perimeter, but now I'm only giving one or two sides of the length. So I need to be looking for congruency. I need to be looking at which are similar sides and similar shapes. And if I'm only given a length and a width, well, which ones are going to be my matching lengths and widths? How can I do that? So things are getting a little more complex, things are getting a little bit more abstract, and now I'm doing the additive of angles. I'm making things just that much more challenging. I'm looking at shapes, and at this point it'd be really great to start using pattern blocks, and I'm using pattern blocks to accept shapes and to make shapes, and I'm looking at them in terms of that. I also want to talk about rays and where line segments are coming together, and where things are joining, and how I can create shapes, and what different angles look like, and what a right angle looks like, and what's going to be smaller than a right angle, and what's going to end up looking larger. And I really want to spend time on this vocabulary, and I really want to spend time here, because this is when I get into 6th and 7th grade, this is all that I'm talking about. And if I don't know congruent, and if I don't know complementary and supplementary, I'm going to be lost in 6th grade. So I want to really spend a lot of time here, and I want to make sure that students are very comfortable, and students are comfortable to experience new parts of measurement, and that we're experiencing new things. I also want to talk about irregular polygons, or I want to have students kind of draw a free shape. Can I find the area? Can I find the perimeter, and how I'm going to do that? If I'm looking at a staircase, am I able to find each step and go around that way? I want to make sure that students are aware of blank space, and I can't just make a big box around it and say that this is, the area or the perimeter of my shape. This isn't the volume of my shape. I'm also going to be taking two different shapes and pushing them together. And not only am I finding the area and I'm finding the perimeter, and I might be able to find the volume if it's a 3D shape, but I'm finding angle measure. I'm listing the different types of angles. I'm able to categorize them that way. I can start using a protractor. I can start talking about supplementary and complementary, and which angles are congruent and which ones are making those bright angles, and what I can combine, what I can do. So these are students that are really kind of using kind of a math lab approach to really experience all that there is in 4th grade for them in measurement. And it's kind of really important to keep going, because 5th grade, that's where we kind of take all of these progressions and all of this stuff that we've been learning, and we're packing it together. We're putting it in a neat shape, and I'm saying you can do all of this, and students need to be able to do all of this so that when they make that bridge to middle school, when they jump that gap, their teachers are ready for them and they're ready for it.